Welcome back from the lunch break. I hope you enjoyed in the break, and this is the last keynote speaker this year. And I'm really glad that Carole Goble is today with us. The presentation is titled FAIR Computational Workflows. And Carole was actually one of the speakers also invited for the first year of the conference. Unfortunately, she wasn't available due to some other her appointments, but I'm really happy that she accepted to be the speaker in this second year of the conference. Carole is a professor of computer science at the University of Manchester in UK, where she leads a team of researchers, research software engineers, and data stewards. She has spent 25 years working in e-science on computational workflows, reproducible science, open sharing, and knowledge and metadata management in a range of disciplines. She has led numerous e-infrastructure projects, including Taverna, one of the first open source computational workflow management systems, and myexperiment.org, the first system agnostic web-based sharing platform for workflows and their related data. To be honest, I used once, I think, the Taverna in one Horizon project. She was the scientific lead of the Workflow Forever project, which pioneered the notation of workflows as preservable and reproducible research objects. She currently co-leads the WorkflowHub.eu registry for workflows, the RoCreate community initiative for packaging, exchanging, and publishing workflows as research objects, and serves on the advisory board of the Common Workflow Language. These are key components of the EOSC-Life Cluster Workflow Collaboratory and a resource of the EU COVID data portal. The tools of the collaboratory are used by other projects from national natural history collection digitalization to climate change modeling. Carole also leads the pan-institutional FAIR-DOM consortium, which manages FAIR data for systems biology and biomedical projects and directs the digital infrastructure for the IBISBA research infrastructure for industrial biotechnology. She co-leads the interoperability platform for Elixir, the EU research infrastructure for life science, and is head of node of Elixir UK. Carole is a co-founder of the UK Software Sustainability Institute and cares about quality research software and reproducibility by building platforms people actually use with teams of people distributed across projects, institutions, and countries. As you heard, it's really rich biography and a good career of our dear professor Carole Goble. So Carole, you have let's say 35 or a little bit more minutes for your presentations, and please leave a couple of minutes for the discussion after your presentation. I'm going now to stop sharing my screen. Then you can share your screen, and you should also unmute yourself. I will just remind the people that you should vote for the best paper at the conference, and I will post the link in the chat. Okay, Carole, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much for the reading out my biography, which was very long. It just shows you that I'm very old. So today I'm going to talk about FAIR computational workflows, and I'm going to try to introduce you to what FAIR computational workflows are, what is the application of the findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable principles that have swept throughout the UK, the Europe, and the USA as a principle for data, and some remarks upon the social aspects of computational workflow infrastructure. So I come from the life sciences community largely, and I'm working in this big project that Dragan mentioned, which is called the European Open Science Cloud Life Project, which brings together 13 life science research infrastructures clustered in order to be able to share infrastructure, share access to infrastructure, and to build infrastructure in order to do research. And they range from chemical compounds to genomics, from tissue banking to plants to marine to humans. So it's quite a big and complicated setup. So this activity is really trying to build a data cloud, if you will, or we prefer to call it a commons, and a method commons. So this is not just making our data available so that it can be shared and and linked together, but also making our processes in this way is an equivalent to SHOC, who actually ran the workshop on vocabularies earlier in this conference. So we have thousands of tools. We have about 19,000 tools registered in the Bio.Tools catalog. We have thousands of data sets held in hundreds of data repositories. We have tens, I would say, of registries, and about 800 metadata formats, which is probably too many. And we do lots of data, pre-processing, processing, post-processing, analysis, and simulations. So one of the things we want to do in order to be able to manage all of this is to build tool interoperability and workflows, and to make them available in containers in this infrastructure. So it turns out that the notion of data-intensive multi-step tool chains, which is what I'm really going to treat workflows as, are widely used in this community for image analysis, for genomic pipelines, for drug discovery, and they all use different systems: Skypian, Toil, Galaxy. These are all different kinds of workflow systems to prepare, analyze, and share their data. So this is a common pattern where you have a series of steps where you want to link the steps together. It's also widespread elsewhere in biodiversity, in climate modeling, in physics. Again, this is a very common activity to identify. So I know that workflow is an overloaded term. And if you go to the SHOC open marketplace and you look at workflows there, really the workflows are instructions on how to do something, which are kind of manual. Do this and then do this and then do this. They're not computational. They might have computational components, which I couldn't get access to, but they're more what we would call in biology lab protocols or standard operating procedures or business process models. They're not kind of the computational ones that I'm going to be talking about, which are these tools in our toolbox that link together other tools. And so here's a picture of such a workflow for COVID, actually, where you have some inputs, you have some outputs, and in between, you have tools that you are linking together and flowing data between. These could be command line tools or other workflows or containers or whatever. Now, the key thing here is that computational workflow ideally has a specification description that describes what you want to do, as that picture shows, and then has some sort of mechanism of executing it, which could be a workflow engine. So it tries to separate out the specification from the description. And so the key attributes of computational workflows is that you can flexibly do this kind of composition. So there's a mechanism to do that, to construct and run them, and to do these control, what step do I do, and the data, how do I flow the data through. You also want to be able to have access to computational infrastructure in the data sets, and that means it acts as a way of interoperating between tools, and it also enables portability of that processing. And for us in the EOSC-Life project, that's really important because it makes an entry point to all the resources. So when you've got hundreds of data sets and hundreds of tools, it's really complicated. But if you have some workflows, they act as the glue that links together and interoperates these different resources and data sets. Here's an example, which is SARS-CoV-2. So it's a COVID workflow, and this is used for variant modeling. So it's automated modeling of data. This runs every 3 hours. It takes in data from national data resources and a big public repository. It runs a set of workflows that are stored in registered in an open registry. It uses a distributed compute network to do this, and it then deposits the results into national dashboards and databases and to notebooks so that other people can do research. So it does this over and over again, and that means it can improve the data quality. These are actually uniformly analyzed. We can submit clean data, and these are actually viewed as transparently ratified methods. So this uses the Galaxy system, one of the workflows I'll be mentioning here, which is kind of an online hosted system which operates as a service platform for workflows in our community. It means it can access large compute resources. This is the picture of one of the workflows. It's designed for direct use, so it has a very webby interface, so you can plug these two things together. It enables experts to build those workflows so that they can then be used by others with their own data, or researchers to make their own. So it's a sort of do-it-yourself platform. Or you can actually just use it to access one tool, because it's quite, it builds an interface so you can do that. And you can, it does all the reporting of histories and so on that you would expect. So it's a very powerful environment. It has 32,000 users, so that gives you some clue about its adoption. And then those workflows are then published, and those workflows are registered in a workflow registry that we've built called WorkflowHub. So again, they're used as objects of publishing and citation, so that other people can then download them, use them, recycle them, and actually just reuse parts of them. So the key thing behind workflows is that you'll see that there are many of these kind of computational tasks that you might be quite familiar with. Data collection, we've heard a lot about that, about data collection, data preparation. So there's data pipelines. Also, if you want to run simulations, so you want to sweep across a set of parameters or sweep across a set of data sets, so you want to run that over and over again. So repetition and reproducibility are strong drivers. But also these systems allow you to do one-off analysis and prototyping, and you can use pre-cooked workflows developed by others for with just your data and your models. And really you can kind of think of them as computational Lego that you can take, pull apart, reuse the bit that you want, and so on. I don't know to the extent that we can do automatic hypothesis generation with workflows yet, but the machine learning community promise that in the future. So these kind of computational tasks mean that you can do quite a lot of very cool stuff. They're kind of recipes that are know-how, as well as publications, and you're using other people's stuff. So you're using other codes and methods that have been kind of tried and tested. It also has a side effect of enabling democratic processing. So you may not be able to use a kind of complicated computational environment with lots and lots of supercomputers, but if somebody else has set up a platform so you can, then you can use the workflows. And that really, I think, is a powerful story for us to, for our infrastructure to enable folks to interoperate data sets, because we've enabled access to these kind of workflows. It also is a way of enabling secure access to sensitive data, very important when you're working in life sciences. So that's computational tasks. What about the sharing and publishing tasks? Because these are kind of hybrid digital objects of scholarship, because on the one hand, they're software. So we can kind of publish software. And on the other hand, they're kind of descriptions of method, because that kind of here are the steps is a kind of publishable recipe. Even if it didn't run anymore, you could see what actually is being done. So that means that we're building a kind of set of services in order to be able to support the fact that these are digital objects of scholarship. So we have registries that link to where the repositories where the workflows are, because they're living objects with dependencies and versions in their own repositories. But we're also then using publishing services, give them DOIs, package them up to put them into Zenodo perhaps, or make them ORCID ID outcomes, put them into knowledge graphs. So they become part of the scholarly communication, scholarly cohort of objects. And of course, because they're software, we need to make sure that they're reusable. So that means we have to do things like monitoring service to make sure, do they still work? What is their quality? Are they portable? Of course, we have the additional piece that if they're made up of, they're basically Lego, that the pieces of Lego have to work. So that means we have to make each of the tools fair, as well as just the workflows. So workflow management system framings tend to really promote the idea that these kinds of approaches are all to do with computational reproducibility. But I wanted to highlight the fact that they're actually as much to do with labor saving, knowledge sharing, and democratization as they are to do with reproducibility. And one can think about what's in it for me, what's in it for my colleagues and projects, and what's in it for the general community. One can think about it at all of these different layers: reproducibility for me, labor saving for me, knowledge sharing in my group, democratization and availability to the wider community. So I'm sure you're thinking, that's great, Carole, but what's that got to do with social sciences and humanities? Well, I think the humanities, as we've seen in this conference, are at a pivotal moment with computation. And the social sciences have been using sort of new data resources, computational social science, computational archival science is getting established. We've seen examples of machine learning, and also examples in this conference of implicit workflows buried in notebooks and tools, because many of you are doing these kinds of multiple steps. And I've got an example that isn't from the humanities world, but something I'm working on, which I think is analogous, which is natural history museum collections that are building these kind of computational workflow ensembles that they kind of constantly rerun as they get new techniques for turning physical objects like pinned insects and their 19th century written labels into digital objects. And this is an example of the workflows that they are building, and they're building it using these kinds of infrastructures, automating things as much as possible so that they can rerun and rerun and rerun, and also expose those methods to scrutiny. I've seen here in the social sciences and humanities several examples, and I also asked my colleagues, Jill Beckelfer and David DeRoy, for examples, and there's examples in music, text mining, computational archival science. I've seen here examples in vocabulary indexing that we saw earlier in the conference. Yesterday, we saw examples in processing and modeling social media data. These are all these kind of high intense multi-step processes. And it's not like you guys don't have a lot of tools. You have an awful lot of tools. And by the way, workflows do not only work with non-interactive tools, they work with interactive tools. Biologists have plenty of GUI-based interactive tools too. They do a lot of text mining, and they do a lot of what you might be called non-consumptive analysis of cohorts, where you want to run the analysis at the data set and then just get the results because of copyright issues. We call it secured federated processing of sensitive data. We can see RapidMiner is in there, and RapidMiner is a workflow system. What about manual steps, you'll cry? Our data is too messy, our creativity, our intellectual know-how. This is all automation, Carole. Can we automate everything? Well, practically all workflows have a human in the loop, which is called humans in the loop, either as a step in a workflow or between workflows, or interacting with a tool that is a step itself. So, we can be sort of part of the workflow, or we can be interacting with a step in the workflow. And this is commonly implemented in notebooks, which then call lots of workflows. You call a workflow, you do something in the notebook, then you do the next one, or workflows as a service platforms like the one I mentioned in Galaxy. The Galaxy one is like that. It allows you to do that kind of interaction. The trick is to automate what can and should be automated and not anything else. So I just wanted to dance a little bit over the workflow system landscape to give you some idea of what there is. And really it's three sorts of areas. Scripts. We've seen many things in this conference around R scripts and RStudio and that sort of thing. Electronic research notebooks, like we could have here a Jupyter Notebook or Google Collaboratory, and then 296 workflow management systems. It's quite a lot. We keep a record of all of these. And then we have repositories where those workflows live. or scripts live, and registries, where we register where they are in the repositories, which we can then also put into the scholarly communication collective set of services. So what's the difference between a workflow and a script then? Well, you remember that we said that we're separating the workflow specification from its execution. We said that earlier. Well, that's exactly what the difference is between a script and a workflow system. It really tries to do that, where scripts tend to muddle that all up. And workflow management systems provide all this other stuff. They provide ways of specifying the inputs and outputs and the parameters, and managing all the associated objects like histories and sample input and output and testing services, and all the infrastructure needed to actually do the workflow execution. So here's I think a comic strip that pretty well sums it up. I made this fully automated data pipeline. It's a giant house of cards made from random scripts. Won't it collapse? It collapses. Oops, I'll just patch it. So the idea of a workflow management system is to move the labor from the workflow maker to the workflow system. And there's a zoo of these workflow management systems, as I hinted at. Different species with different properties, from those aimed at the do-it-yourself researcher just running off the desktop, to those to building big community platforms, lightweight frameworks, to full engines. It depends where they sit in the software stack as well, which I'll go into in a little minute. But basically, the take-up of any one system depends on whether the tools you want can be plugged into it with the right data types, and everybody else is using it. So that's pretty well the distinction between why one system gets used and another system doesn't. To maintain the kind of animal theme, here's a workflow system called SnakeMake, which is kind of different to the Galaxy one I mentioned, which is very visual. You're manipulating the tools visually. Here, this is scripts. It's strictly scripts. It's quite lightweight. It's about setting up rules for you to be able to build graphs of jobs. And that's kind of widely used as well. It's a different kind of user, more of a script maker. And we also use heavily, using the whales here, things like containers, where you can containerize a step, and you can containerize the whole shebang. So containers are really important for workflow systems because they give us portability. So to sort of sum up where workflow systems really fit, there's this kind of acronym. They allow you to do composition, they do abstraction away from, because you can describe what you want to do and let the engine do the work. They enable you to do scalability, automation, and do some automated reporting. And they kind of work at two layers. There's ones that work at the user level. That's the ones I'm talking about here, where you can chain together tools. And there's ones that work at the underwear level, underneath the infrastructure. And they're doing things like job parallelization and running things across HPC and that kind of thing. So the different workflow systems there. Basically, they help manage mess, they handle heavy lifting, and they enable you to report and reproduce. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why, and I won't go into the details of that. So they're workhorses. They're really sort of labor-saving workhorses. But the law of computational labor and cost conservation says labor and costs do not diminish. They just shift to different people at different parts of the technology stack, different points in the research cycle. So great, you shifted all this complexity of running all these and operating all of these different tools and linking them together, but somebody has to pay, somebody has to build that. It requires infrastructure. The tools need to be wrapped to make them viable, composable components. You need to write these workflows, you need to be able to find and understand them, and so on. So what effectively we have is a community of different stakeholders running from the very techie through to the not techie at all, but want to just have the workflows kind of there as a fill out here's my data, now run it type of world. Work from workflow system being used as a platform directly to as a service, as it were. So we have this range of stakeholders. Of course, the labor is high at one end with technical expertise, but the reach and lower expertise goes to the other end. So you've shifted the labor into those building these systems and managing them from the labor of people having to use them. Because one end, you're having to make sure that everything's interoperable, usable and reusable, which is a key point of our FAIR. It's the I and the R of our FAIR. And the other end, you want to be able to help folks find and access them, particularly things that have already been built. So here, you can think about in the middle, if you're just using something for yourself, one of these lightweight systems, you're probably in the middle. But if you want to build something for the community, then you have to invest much more to the left-hand side, because you're building something for more people on the right-hand side. And that's kind of what we're doing in the EOSC-Life project. So I asked Dragon if actually anybody knew what the FAIR principles were, because I hadn't heard them much at this meeting. And he said, stick a slide in that tell you what they are. And to save you reading the paper, I've given you the 5 bullet points here. They're about persistent, machine readable and actionable metadata on your data, persistent identifiers, clear licensing, mechanisms for machine accessibility of data and metadata, and that you must register and index your objects. That's it. That's what the FAIR principles really are. So we can then see that for workflows, they're kind of interesting because they're hybrid objects. And you can tell this by looking at a sort of, this is the hierarchy of the bioschema.org specification of what a workflow is. Bioschema is a version of, an opinionated version of schema, which I will mention in a minute. So they're both method objects like creative works, where you can think about the FAIR data principles that I just mentioned can be adapted, and they're software objects which actually really work. And the FAIR data principles aren't designed for that, so they need to be revised. So as method objects, we need to know about identifiers and metadata, and as software objects, we need to worry about, are they reusable? Are they, can we put them together? Do they still work? From the FAIR metadata from the metadata point of view, there's actually been a whole bunch of community efforts to describe workflows. I've heard a lot here about describing data and data catalogs. We heard some of that earlier today. Well, this is describing workflows. So we have mechanisms for a kind of common canonical descriptions, regardless of whether you're one of the 296 systems. We've got a couple of languages, but the common workflow language is that perhaps the most popular, which attempts to give you a canonical description that is machine and human readable, regardless of your system. And then we use schema.org as a way of creating the metadata control vocabulary to describe what those workflows are about, what they are, whereas the workflow description tells you what they do. And we also have a standard for being able to access them through an API. The only thing that is bio-specific is the ontology we use to type the inputs and outputs, which we use an ontology called EDAM. And then we package the whole thing together, all the workflow components, all the inputs and the outputs and the different associated objects with metadata into a citable FAIR digital object, which is something we called Workflow RO Crate. And that's a format for reporting and exchanging these workflows between services, regardless of which system you're using, regardless if it's Galaxy or SnakeMake or whatever, and archiving them. And we also use that when we run workflows and we want to be able to describe what their histories were. So we package that all together. As these workflows are actually really instruments, they're like instruments like microscopes are instruments, or telescopes are instruments, they're data instruments. So they have a duty to design for FAIR data. And in fact, the FAIR principles were primarily intended as guidelines for machine processable data and metadata for automation. That was the point of the FAIR data principles, actually. And that means we need to enable for the workflows to work, we need programmatic access to data metadata and to avoid restrictions. And then we need the workflows to behave well, behave fairly. So that means they have to make identifiers properly, and they have to avoid proprietary formats, and they have to track the history of the data that they generate. And we have to license that data properly as well. That means that there's a big drive of community efforts in the life sciences community to create quality assured and readable workflows and workflow blocks. So these are sort of canonical workflows, components, Lego pieces that you can then put together into make bigger workflows where you know that they behave fairly and you know that they will still work. And to build these libraries of them and to design our analysis through using workflow blocks in this way. And then we can recycle really efficiently, and we can exchange our pipelines or our analysis between platforms. It doesn't matter which system. Are you using Galaxy? Are you using Nextflow? Are you using SnakeMake? Who cares? It doesn't matter. You will be able to exchange them. And we also have repositories and communities that build curated sets, and we register them in a registry. So stand by here. So that means we had to build a whole bunch of services in the EOSC-Life project and take a deep breath. What does the collaboratory look like? Oh, my word. Yes, let's move on. So it's a non-trivial activity here. So I want to finish up in my last 2 or 3 minutes about some words around social science of workflow, this workflow village that is building these services, is building these workflow systems, is building the workflows and using them, and is kind of working together. And in our community at least, and I'm sure that this happens in social sciences and humanities, this is open communities all working together completely regardless of organizational project and national boundaries, and everybody gets credit. So this is because this is really coming from the open science and open source software cultural norms, where we have some dedicated core teams that are kind of funded off grants, but we have a very open community that joins in. And that includes the standards as well as the platforms that we're building. And it recognizes this is an open ecosystem. There's no one system. There's 290 odd, but within our world, there's probably about 10 to 15 that were really widely used. We have to respect them and we onboard them. We don't replace them, although communities are clustering around a few for economies of scale and support. So really, it's not just the technical infrastructure, it's also the policy and processes around using these and the cultural community practices of building and using them. And a concrete example is the Workflow Hub, which I lead off. It's a registry. It started just over a year ago. It was rapidly released. It was released 1 year early in order to be able to host COVID workflows, and is listed in the European Union's COVID data portal as a result. About 1/3 of the workflows in it are COVID related. This is the kind of thing that you can see in the registry. And because it was done early, we've done it all in the open. So if we can have a look a little bit to see, what I'm talking about here, that you can go visit the source. So this isn't, this is a registry. So it respects the fact that the workflows are actually somewhere else. They're in a repository somewhere. We're giving credit to the developers and custodians in order to build citation and credit profiles, as we discussed in the earlier panel. There's discussion forums to bring together the developers of workflows with the potential users of them. There's licensing information. There's analytics for impact profile building. There's support for teams and people and spaces, so you can link up the workflow providers with the users, so Australian Biocommons, for example, here, and you can build visibility and reputation, because it's really important to close the loop of reciprocity, which is, you know, people go in, they find something, they get it, they use it, and they don't credit. It's really important to get that credit loop in, and as a result, we're kind of also working with OpenAir, DataCite, and other tools to build knowledge graphs to find out, okay, where were these workflows used, in which papers, and so on. And in order to be able to build this workflow hub, we needed to have this magic diamond, which is what you need when you need to build an open community activity. You need a community with leadership for actually delivering the service or the tool or whatever it is you want to do. You need sponsorship to give you the resources. You need champions who will bake it in to their systems or bake it into their practices. And you need users and drivers to give you a purpose to get the adoption. And COVID gave us all of these things. So in the last year, we've been working in this club, in this open community effort, perpetual open development with all of these different projects in using hackathons and as a really powerful way to build workflows, to write workflows, to build workflow systems, to build workflow registries, and so on. And actually, we must be the only community where lockdown has been brilliant. It's been amazingly productive because it's really good for this kind of thing, because we're all geeks sitting on our laptops. We live digitally, and it's brilliant for pan project, pan organization work, because the COVID gave us a chance for equitable participation. Whereas if we made everybody meet, it would have been a disaster. My final words are on, of course, you need community leadership also to do capacity building, help people get on board. And here's some examples from the Galaxy workflow system: extensive training network, community conferences, mechanisms of co-fests or hackathons where everybody gets together and eats pizza and works on a problem. And so there's an extensive community. So I wanted to get across here, there's an enormous social aspect to these workflow, computational workflows, and making them fair and making them available to folks. So this is my final slide, which is TLDL, which stands for Too Long Didn't Listen. Computational workflows are a significant tool in the toolbox of computational research. It's not just about research productivity, but it's also reproducibility, but it's also about democratization. There are labor and cost shifts, and but workflows are a hybrid and important digital object of scholarship, and that means FAIR has to be applied to them in a different kind of way, but equally it gets applied. And it really takes a village, it takes a whole community in order to be able to use these or make workflows that we should do. But all computational research takes a village. In fact, all research takes a village. And here's my acknowledgements. And thank you, Dragan.
Thank you very much for a really nice presentation. I noticed 4 questions in Q&A for you, but 3 are coming from the Tommy Suminen. So Tommy, I will give you the option also to speak if you want to unmute yourself, or maybe it will be easier because you have 3 questions. So would you like to ask your question alive?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Tommy.
All right. Well, thanks. I was indeed listening and paying a lot of attention. A lot of you, well, I currently work on many EOSC-related things. So that's the European Open Science Cloud. And there are many parallels with what you're talking about and what they're trying to achieve. One of the differences, of course, is they're trying to make an omnipotent discipline independent platform, while this was targeted at a specific discipline in a way. I guess the most important question I have is, what parallels do you see between the things that you presented on these workflows and the efforts that I hope you have heard from EOSC, who are trying to build, for example, a marketplace for service providers such as high performance computing centers, container hosting services, data repositories, and trying to bring these together at a European level so that they would be kind of discoverable across geographic boundaries and discipline boundaries.
Yes, yes, Tommy. So I think the word EOSC in the title of the EOSC-Life project gives a clue. So this is actually part of the European Open Science Cloud Cluster projects. I'm also in the EOSC Enhanced project, by the way, which is a project to do with the marketplace. So many of the services that I'm talking about here are registered in the marketplace. And actually, I gave a plenary talk at the EOSC Symposium, because where several people from the kind of EOSC community reported that actually what we'd done was built EOSC, which of course is what every research infrastructure cluster has done, because effectively we're all building mini EOSCs. There's, when you look at the actual infrastructure that we've built, which is, I had that scary picture that I jumped over, this one here, that this is actually, and you think, well, okay, this here, how much of this is bio-specific? And the answer is none of it, not a single. So the actual, although they have the word biocontainers, it's just containers. Bio.tools is just tools. The only thing that makes them different are the ontologies associated with them and the data sets, that the data formats that they typically use. But pretty well everything, nearly everything here is actually application independent. So, you know, Galaxy is used in particle physics. SnakeMake is used extensively in particle physics, actually. And there's one or two that are a bit specialized, maybe, you know, that come from specific communities, but mostly it's pretty generic. So one of the things we're doing with the EOSC Task Force and other EOSC projects, the EOSC Future project, is trying to demonstrate that the research infrastructures, of which we are an example, aren't just users of this thing called EOSC. We are EOSC. That, Tommy, it's not a kind of them and us. We are all in it together.
So would you say that, I mean, do you foresee that somehow the marketplace and these workflows could integrate? Because at current, you can go to the marketplace and make orders for individual services, and then you negotiate in some manner with the service provider.
Yes.
But the workflows is basically, I think, what it aims at eventually, in the sense that you would be able to plug and play basically data sources and services from there.
Yes. Yes, I think I see exactly what you mean, Tommy. And yes, I think you're right. Yeah, there's the registering of the services, and they're registering workflows as services. And I think that's a very compelling idea. I don't think the EOSC marketplace really supports it in its current form, but we might encourage it to do so. So I think that's a great idea, Tommy.
Because I somehow see that this is what you presented here is the EOSC vision for the marketplace, that's what the aim basically.
Yeah, but it's also, you can just use this as a researcher and a PhD student in a lab. You can just find, this is the full shebang, right? But then you can just go and use one of these systems to just do your own thing on your local desktop with your local kind of computer. There's something for everybody in this kind of world.
So now, like I wrote my questions from the detail to the general, so now I can drill down to the more specifics a little bit more. You mentioned here the data ontologies.
Yes.
So, then my question was, first question was, what do you do with regard to data schema interoperability? Do you do crosswalks between schemas, and how do you manage the different schemas that the data are in?
Yes, we've got a lot of different formats. So we do, so there's several things that we do, Tommy. The first is we, of course, do what everybody else does, which is attempt to get everybody harmonized, at least in a community, over certain data formats, which, which is, of course, a challenge. And there is no real life science community. There are just lots of sub-communities. So we are doing that, and we're doing that through standardization. We have a repository called, or registry called Fair Sharing, where we maintain all of our formats. The second thing is, of course, you can't necessarily really succeed totally in that because of all the legacy issues. And there we do a lot of mapping. And that's where workflows are actually quite handy, because we can do, we can make what are called shim services. So shim services are mapping services effectively, that when you have to bridge, you have to bridge. And so these are kind of crosswalk activities. And we do them kind of on demand. When you need to do it, you do it, and then you pool what you've done. So if you look at these kind of workflow systems, they build big libraries of these kinds of intermediate step things that handle the fact that with the best will in the world, your data schema aren't interoperable. So you have to do mapping between identifiers and between the schema. So, but you can.
Did I get it correctly that the crosswalks are stored in this fair sharing service?
The crosswalks. So the fair sharing has started to hold crosswalks, but the formats and the ontologies are in the fair sharing service. They're registered in the fair sharing service, and the different workflow systems and different tools attempt to use the formats of their community, and we're trying to migrate them towards those formats so they plug together. And when they don't, the workflow management systems take it upon themselves to do that wrapping. So they effectively build wrappers around things so that they do interoperate properly. And that's what these kind of wrapping services do. So we're trying to do it kind of in the, get people on board to the appropriate standards, and then we fix it when they don't. Do you see what I mean, Tommy? And that's the benefit of the workflow systems, that they help you do that. Whereas script systems, you have to do it all yourself.
And the last question I think I posted, at least on the questions, was, do you PID the workflows? Are they?
Yes, of course. Yes, of course they are. So all the workflows, when they get registered in the workflow hub, they have a PID. And then when you want to publish them, you can give them a DOI. So so you give them a DOI, and so yes, we do. We have to give them persistent identifiers, and we have to handle something which I didn't mention because I didn't have time, of course, which is they all version because they're living artifacts, because they're living objects, because they're software. So you will have multiple versions of them. So the registries have to handle the versions, and the identifiers have to handle versions as well.
Yeah, so that's just like the data sets, basically. They have to have unique identifiers.
Yeah, they have to unique identifiers, but these unique identifiers are more challenging perhaps than some data sets, because you have to deal with the versioning issue. Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. And if you're going to build sort of, workflow graphs, as it were, or knowledge graphs, where you have workflows using other workflows, you really need identifiers. So that's a very important piece. I can see there was a question about GDPR as well.
Yes.
To encourage data security by design, yes. Could and should FAIR be addressed in the same way when building tools and services? The short answer, anonymous attendee, is yes. There we are. That was a quick answer to that. Yes, FAIR by design. We're trying to do FAIR workflows by design, but we want ideally FAIR data by design, FAIR tool by design, just like we have secure by design.
Okay, do we have any further question for Carole before we close this session?
I could still a little bit ask related to where Carole just finished off. you manage knowledge graphs.
Yes.
So do the workflows, the data sets, the outputs of the workflows, the calculation results, and then perhaps the related publications, they're all pitted entities. And do you anywhere kind of generate knowledge graphs based on all these outputs, or do you know where this would be?
So that's a piece of work we're doing, Tommy. So at the moment we as the different objects, like the papers will go into paper repositories, because that's where people will put their papers. The workflows are in the workflow registry. They're and registered there, and they're in their repositories. The data sets will be likely in the data repositories that are the best data repositories for there. And then you want to be able to gather them all together. So we use in our environment this thing called an RO crate. So an RO crate packages all of this together. And then we're working with OpenAir and DataCite in order to be able to put those contents into the OpenAir knowledge graph, but also to use their knowledge graphs in order to be able to enrich our own representation of where everything is in these RO crates. And the Workflow Hub is a kind of RO crate holder, as it were, or maker, as it were. So it's not just, we're moving these things around. You don't just want to say, here's the service, here's the hub, and it has all of this information. You also want to be able to say, I want to package all that information and ship it to somewhere else, but it still has all the links to all the other objects. And those objects will be in other places, because we will not be putting a terabyte of data into one of these objects. It has to be held where the data is, and you need to point to it. So there's an entire talk on RO crates to be done here, and I can send you a link to a talk that's later on Friday in the